The worst night of my life began with a broken glass and a feeling in my chest that something was terribly wrong. I still remember the exact moment. The restaurant was warm, crowded, and glowing with soft golden lights, but inside me everything felt cold. My blind date sat across from me, scrolling through his phone with the kind of boredom that made it painfully obvious he didn't want to be there. The waiter had barely placed the water glasses on the table when one slipped from my nervous hands and shattered across the floor. The entire room turned to look. My face burned with embarrassment. And that was when the waitress leaned down beside me and quietly said something that would change everything. "If I were you, I'd stay." Before we begin this story, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe to the channel if you believe that life can change in the most unexpected moments. Because sometimes, the worst night of your life becomes the beginning of something you never saw coming. My name is Emily Carter, and up until that evening, my life felt like a long series of quiet disappointments. I was 28 years old, working a modest job at a local publishing office, and living alone in a small apartment that always seemed a little too quiet at night. Most of my friends were already married or engaged, posting smiling pictures online while I spent my weekends with books and microwave dinners. The blind date had been arranged by my coworker, Lisa. She insisted that her cousin Daniel was perfect for me. She described him as successful, charming, and thoughtful. After months of being alone, I finally agreed. I spent hours preparing that evening. I carefully chose a simple blue dress, curled my hair, and even practiced smiling in the mirror. A small, hopeful voice inside me whispered that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this would be the beginning of something good. The restaurant was elegant but cozy, a place where couples came to celebrate anniversaries and families gathered for special occasions. Soft music drifted through the air, and the scent of fresh bread and roasted garlic filled the room. Daniel arrived 10 minutes late. At first, I tried to ignore it. People run late all the time, I told myself. But when he finally sat down, his attention never fully arrived with him. He checked his phone constantly, barely looked at me, and answered my questions with short, distracted responses. Within 15 minutes, I realized the truth. He wasn't interested. He talked about himself endlessly, his job, his expensive car, his gym routine, while barely asking a single thing about me. When I tried to share something about my work, he nodded politely but quickly changed the subject back to himself. And then came the moment with the glass. My hands were already shaking with nervousness when I reached for the water. The glass slipped, hit the edge of the table, and shattered across the floor with a loud crash that silenced the entire restaurant. People turned. Conversations paused. A wave of humiliation washed over me. Daniel sighed loudly, leaning back in his chair as if my clumsiness had personally inconvenienced him. That was when the waitress appeared. She moved quickly and calmly, kneeling beside the table to gather the broken pieces. She was probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes and tired hands that suggested she had worked long shifts for many years. As she cleaned the glass, she looked up at me with a small, understanding smile. Then she leaned slightly closer and whispered something unexpected. "If I were you, I'd stay." At first, I thought I had heard her wrong. Why would I stay? The date was clearly a disaster. Daniel had already started texting someone again, barely acknowledging the situation. Everything in me wanted to stand up, apologize, and escape the embarrassment as quickly as possible. But something about the waitress's tone made me hesitate. It wasn't just advice. It sounded like a quiet secret. The evening continued awkwardly. Daniel ordered the most expensive steak on the menu and spent most of dinner complaining about his coworkers. I barely touched my food. My thoughts kept drifting back to the waitress's strange words. Stay. Why? As the meal dragged on, I noticed small things happening around the restaurant. The waitress who had spoken to me moved gracefully from table to table, helping an elderly couple cut their food, laughing gently with a family celebrating a birthday, and patiently listening to a little boy who wanted to show her a drawing. She treated every person like they mattered. Even me. At one point she passed by our table again, quietly refilling my water glass. For a brief moment, our eyes met. She gave me a small nod, as if reminding me of something important. The dinner finally ended when Daniel checked his watch and announced he had an early meeting the next morning. He didn't offer dessert. He didn't suggest another meeting. He simply paid the bill and walked me outside. Under the cold streetlights, he gave a quick, polite goodbye that felt more like a business transaction than the end of a date. Then he walked away. Just like that. I stood on the sidewalk alone, the night air cool against my face, feeling smaller than I had in years. I had spent hours preparing for this evening, hoping it might lead somewhere meaningful. Instead, it had only reminded me how lonely my life had become. I turned back toward the restaurant, planning to step inside for a moment before calling a ride home. The warm glow of the lights welcomed me again, and the soft hum of conversation wrapped around the room. I found myself sitting alone at the bar, unsure why I hadn't simply left. A few minutes later, the same waitress approached. She placed a small slice of chocolate cake in front of me. "On the house," she said gently. But what surprised me most was the expression on her face. It wasn't pity. It was hope. For a moment we simply stood there in silence. Then she explained something that made my heart stop. Earlier that evening, a man had been sitting at the table behind us. A quiet man who had spent most of the night reading while waiting for someone who never showed up. He had noticed everything. The awkwardness, the broken glass, Daniel's indifference, and the way I tried so hard to remain kind anyway. Before leaving, he had quietly paid for my dessert. And he had left a note. My heart pounded as the waitress placed the folded paper in front of me. The handwriting was simple and steady. "I'm sorry your date didn't see what I saw tonight. Someone who stays kind even when things fall apart is rare. If you'd ever like to share a cup of coffee with someone who actually listens, my number is below." For a long moment, I simply stared at the paper. The waitress smiled softly. "That's why I told you to stay." Something warm spread through my chest. For the first time that night, I felt something other than embarrassment. Possibility. I looked around the restaurant, suddenly wishing I had noticed the quiet stranger earlier. But he was gone. Still, the note remained in my hands. A small piece of unexpected hope. And sometimes, hope is all it takes to change everything. 3 days later, I gathered the courage to send a simple message. What followed was not a fairy tale. It didn't happen overnight, but it was real. The man from the note, his name was Michael, turned out to be thoughtful, patient, and deeply kind. Our first coffee lasted 4 hours. Our second lasted 6. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen. Not because I was perfect, but because I wasn't. Months later, we returned to the same restaurant together. The same waitress was there, smiling when she recognized me. She remembered the broken glass, the terrible date, and the quiet moment that changed everything. That night, Michael and I left the biggest tip we could afford. Not just for the service, but for the kindness that altered the course of my life. Before we finish, I want to ask you something special. In the comments below, write the word kindness if you believe one small act of kindness can completely change someone's life. And if this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this. Because sometimes a broken glass, a quiet waitress, and one simple decision to stay, can lead you exactly where you were meant to be all along.